Greetings all, and welcome to the Labor Force Podcast, where we talk about the rise of labor militancy and the awareness that capitalism is a rotten deal. I'm your host, Mike Strukin, proud member of New York State United Teachers. So I went to fill up my tank yesterday morning, and here in Watertown, New York, it was $4.25 a gallon. So it hasn't gone down worth a shit since the last time I did when it was just over about $4. So in the end, it was over $60 total. A $60 trip to fill up my tank. And I'm sure it's probably not so much better for you where you are. So we're feeling the squeeze, we're feeling the pinch, we're feeling the effects of this ongoing war. So let's talk about some of the factors, starting, of course, with Trump. A new AP NORC poll, highlighted by PBS NewsHour, shows his approval on the economy has dropped to about 30%, down sharply in just a month, as the war with Iran pushes prices higher. And that part makes sense. Gas prices go up, shipping costs rise, everything gets more expensive. People feel it immediately. About 3/4 of Americans now say the economy is poor and frustration is on the rise. But here's the part that matters for workers, and this is where it gets deeper than just inflation is bad. Because rising prices are only half the story. The other half is, why don't wages rise with them? A recent piece from NPR Planet Money breaks this down, and the answer isn't just the market. It's power. Specifically, something economists call monopsony, a situation where employers have outsized power over workers if there's more than one company around. In that kind of system, employers don't have to compete that hard for labor, which means they can keep wages lower than you'd expect. In other words, the labor market isn't nearly as free as we're told, and of course we knew that. So now put these two things together. You got a war driving up prices, and you got a labor market where wages are held structurally down. That's not just inflation. Again, that's a squeeze. Because if this were a truly competitive system, rising costs would force wages up too. But instead, what we're seeing is workers absorbing the shock. Prices go up quickly, wages move slowly, if at all, and the gap, that comes straight out of quality of life. So yeah, approval ratings are falling, that's the headline, but the bigger story is this. It's not just that the economy feels bad. It's that the system of volatile, unstable capitalism is built in a way where if things go wrong, workers are the ones who pay first and recover last. According to PBS, quote, Trump's falling approval ratings could create problems for his party as it tries to defend House and Senate majorities in the midterm elections. The poll finds that Trump is especially weak on cost of living, and enthusiasm about Trump's performance has waned over the past year among his own supporters. And in a really telling indicator about our economy in general, it doesn't really matter who's been in office recently. The piece also notes, quote, Trump's approval ratings are in line with his predecessor Joe Biden's lowest approval rating in the AP NORC polling, 36%, which came during July 2022 after inflation spiked to a 4-decade high. Biden's approval ratings recovered slightly as inflation eased, raising a question as to whether Trump can quickly regroup to show tangible progress. And of course, we know that answer. Meanwhile, a recent CNBC survey finds that rising gas prices are significantly straining household budgets and forcing many Americans to cut back on spending, with a majority saying higher fuel costs are affecting their financial decisions and overall outlook. As gas prices climb, driven in part by global energy disruptions, consumers report scaling back on discretionary purchases like dining out, entertainment, and even some everyday expenses, reflecting a broader affordability squeeze where price increases are outpacing income growth. The survey also highlights growing pessimism, with many respondents expecting little to no relief in gas prices, especially in the near future. And staying with this theme, The Hill reports that job satisfaction among U.S. workers has fallen to a new low based on a recent New York Federal Reserve survey, with declines across pay, benefits, and opportunities in advancement. Workers are also increasingly stuck in place, as they reported the lowest likelihood of moving to a new employer in 5 years, falling to 9.7%, even as dissatisfaction grows. The report highlights that satisfaction with compensation and career mobility has dropped to record lows, reinforcing a broader trend of frustration in the labor force. And again, fewer workers are attempting to leave their jobs, suggesting limited opportunities in a slowing labor market. So the findings point to a workforce that is increasingly unhappy and constrained, with declining satisfaction paired with reduced mobility and fewer viable alternatives. And here we go again with the churn in this administration. This time, Lori Chavez DeRemer resigned as U.S. Labor Secretary Monday, with the White House stating she would leave to take a job in the private sector and that Deputy Secretary Keith Sonderling would serve as acting head of the department. Her departure came amid an ongoing Inspector General investigation into allegations of misconduct, including claims of misuse of government resources and inappropriate relationship with a member of her security detail, as well as broader concerns about workplace behavior and management at the DOL. Reports note that multiple aides had already been pushed out or resigned during the probe, and that her exit makes her the third cabinet official to step down in a short span, underscoring wider instability within this administration. And what else do we expect? Despite the controversy, officials publicly praised her tenure, while she maintained her innocence and said she did not want to be a distraction as the investigation continued. So that detail, that she is the third cabinet official to step down in a short span, is not just a passing note, it's a red flag. Cabinet-level turnover at that pace is highly unusual, except in a Trump administration, and signals deeper dysfunction inside the executive branch. These positions are supposed to provide continuity, expertise, steady leadership across massive federal agencies, especially the one in charge of workers in this country. So obviously the federal government's not designed to operate with this kind of churn at the top, and when it does, it raises serious questions about stability, oversight, and the administration's ability to govern effectively. And that's been the Trump decade, to say the least. Here was Bernie questioning Chavez DeRemer at her confirmation hearing. Smoke and mirrors right from the start.
You're not the Congresswoman from Oregon anymore, right?
No, sir.
Okay. You're trying to become Secretary of Labor. Let me back up and say a word about what the PRO Act is. I'm not sure that most Americans know what it is. The reality is that in America today, labor unions have the support of some 70% of the American people. You know why? Because people understand that the big corporations and their bosses have all the power. People understand that CEOs make 300 times more than their workers. And people say, you know what, the only way we're going to get decent wages and benefits is when we organize. Millions of people want to join unions, but they can't join unions. You know why? Because corporations day after day operate in illegal ways. They break the law. They say to somebody, you were late 3 years ago. You're a pro-union, you were late 3 years, you're fired. We're going to take you into a captive audience, and for hour after hour, we're going to tell you how bad unions are. You want to join a union? Fine, you vote for a union, we're moving the plant to China. All of that stuff happens to be illegal. All of that stuff happens to be done every single day by corporate America. So, let me get back to the original question. PRO Act is designed to prevent illegal behavior on the part of corporate America, on the part of employers, so that workers can make a free choice. Do you support the PRO Act?
Thank you, Ranking Member Sanders, and I appreciate the conversation. I support the American worker. President Trump...
Okay, I don't mean to be rude.
No, you're
we don't
not
have
rude.
a lot of time. I'm gathering that you no longer support the PRO Act, is what I hear. That you support the American worker, that's what everybody here will say. Ms. Chavez, DeRemer, in 2021, President Biden signed the Butch-Lewis Act that prevented the earned pension benefits of some 2 million union workers and retirees from being cut by up to 65%. There are people in Congress who want to undo that enormously important legislation. What do you feel about the Butch-Lewis Act?
I support the Butch-Lewis Act in protecting their retirements.
And you will go to the wall, to go to the mat supporting it?
I do support protecting people's retirements.
Federal minimum wage is $7.25. State after state has voted to raise the minimum wage. Somehow we can't do it here in Washington. 20 million workers are making less than $15 an hour. Do you support raising the minimum wage to a living wage?
Ranking Member Sanders, you know that that is an issue for Congress to determine and raising the minimum wage. As the Secretary of Labor, I cannot weigh in on that. That's determined by Congress. If they want to negotiate that, I will fully and fairly enforce the law as a Labor Secretary, if you all so choose, and give you whatever data possible to make that decision as members of Congress.
Well, I understand that Congress makes the law, but you have an opinion, and you will be the leading advocate for workers if you are confirmed. Question, If you were sitting where I'm sitting, would you vote to raise the minimum wage to a living wage?
Well, I'm not sitting where you're sitting hypothetically. I used to, but not any longer. But I do recognize that the minimum wage hasn't been raised since 2009, and the cost of living has gone up. But again, I cannot sit here and determine what that wage will be fully and fairly. I will enforce the law, but it will be up to Congress to determine, because that is not in the purview of the Secretary of Labor. For instance, in Oregon, I know that in Portland, Oregon, that the minimum wage is almost $16 an hour, and that might work for Portland, but that's not going to work for Grants Pass, Oregon. And I know that local communities, states determine what's best for their economy. What we don't want to do is shock the economy. But again, sitting here today, I cannot determine as Secretary of Labor if it should be.
Michelle,
And according to Fight Back News, her replacement's also a snake, as you'd expect. Quote, Sonderling is viewed as a Washington insider with significant connections to big business interests and in Republican circles of influence that include connections to business and politicians in his home state of Florida, where attacks on unions and the working class have been ramping up under Trump. Many business leaders and right-wingers were surprised when Chavez de Remer was appointed in 2025, expecting a more vicious right-wing, pro-business, anti-worker secretary. This led to those business and right-wing leaders lobbying Trump to appoint Sonderling as the number 2 person in the DOL under de Remer. Sonderling was believed to have played a significant role in Elon Musk's Doge early in Trump's second presidency. While it is yet to be seen what will come of Sonderling's appointment, it signals a move toward an even less worker-friendly DOL and a shift further to the right in the secretary's office. So, we'll see what happens. You trade one fucking viper for another snake, and as long as the Trump administration stays in power, it's what we're going to have to deal with. But that's why the labor movement fights as it does. We do have a fully staffed NLRB, so hopefully we can make some things happen despite these oppositions. But the greatest federal hits don't stop there.
Hundreds of civilian employees on Fort Drum are at risk of losing their union rights. It's a move that is drawing outrage from union leaders.
It comes after a memo from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Garrett Dombluski joins us live in studio with more. Garrett?
Hey, Les and Diane. This is a continuation of Executive Order 14251, which President Trump signed last year, banning federal employee unions for many agencies. At the time, he cited national security concerns as the reason for it. On Fort Drum, it is members of AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees, who are affected. Reportedly, that's about 600 civilian workers there. In a memo from April 9th, Secretary Hegseth gave officials 24 hours to terminate collective bargaining agreements. AFGE Local 400 on Fort Drum called it a direct assault on their rights. In this Facebook post, the union said this affects more than 1 million federal employees in total. It said, quote, while they may try to tear up the paper, they cannot break our solidarity or our commitment to each other. Maintain your membership, do not resign. The union called this a continuation of illegal retaliation by the Trump administration. And we've reached out to the offices for Congress members Elise Stefanik and Claudia Tenney, as well as union officials to learn more. We'll update you when we know more.
Everything is national security, right? Everett Kelly, AFGE national president, called Hegseth's action cowardly and an attack on the many veterans who serve as civilian Defense Department employees. Nationwide, AFG represents about 300,000 Defense Department employees. Kelly said in a statement that the union is reviewing Hegseth's order and could file a lawsuit challenging the decision. The civilian defense workers have retained union rights for 50 years under multiple presidents during peace and war, Kelly said. Quote, Secretary Hegseth's decision to terminate the union rights of hardworking individuals who support our military is a cowardly continuation of this administration's unlawful attack on federal employees' First Amendment right to belong to a union. And that's still not all. Let's get into the visceral day-to-day reality of whether dinner is actually happening tonight. Because right now, there's a growing body of reporting in a recent piece from Slate that makes something very clear. When you mess with food assistance, you're not just tightening budgets, you're messing with people's mental health. We're talking about SNAP, of course, food stamps, a program that millions of Americans rely on just to get through the week. And what's happening isn't just a policy change, it's instability, it's uncertainty, it's the constant question hanging over people's heads. Is this still going to be there next month? And that uncertainty, that's the story. Because the policies being pushed, particularly under Trump and the Republican lawmakers, aren't small tweaks. We're talking about proposals to cut tens, even hundreds of billions of dollars from SNAP over time, stricter work requirements, shifting costs onto states, limiting what benefits can even be used for, redefining eligibility so fewer people qualify in the first place. That's not trimming around the edges. That's fundamentally reshaping the program. And here's where it gets more serious than the usual policy debate, because the research is pretty clear. Food insecurity isn't just about hunger. As the article puts it, food insecurity doesn't just harm physical health. It also takes a toll on mental health, of course. So if you don't know whether you can feed your family next week, that's not just a logistical problem, that's anxiety, that's stress, that's lying awake at night doing math that never quite works out. That's the kind of pressure that builds into depression and worse over time. And what makes this even worse is that it's not just the cuts themselves, it's the threat of them. You don't have to lose your benefits to feel the impact, you just have to think you might. That's the environment being created here. Not just scarcity, but instability. Not just fewer resources, but more fear. And look, you can have a political debate about the size of government, about safety nets, about budgets. That's fair game. But what this reporting highlights is that these decisions don't stay on paper. They show up in people's daily lives, in their stress levels, in their health, and whether they can feel secure enough to function. Because at the end of the day, food isn't optional. And when access to it becomes uncertain, everything else starts to unravel. So when you hear about SNAP cuts framed as numbers on a spreadsheet, understand what's underneath that. It's not just reduced spending. It's again increased anxiety, a real psychological strain. It's millions of people being told in one way or another that something as basic as eating is negotiable. But there's more on this as well. A bipartisan group of lawmakers has introduced new legislation that would allow recipients of SNAP to purchase hot rotisserie chickens, a change aimed at addressing what supporters see as an outdated restriction. Currently, SNAP benefits cannot be used for hot prepared foods, meaning shoppers can buy a rotisserie chicken only after it's cooled, even though there is no meaningful difference in the food itself. The proposed Hot Rotisserie Chicken Act, introduced in both the House and Senate, would amend federal law to make the ready-to-eat item eligible, without expanding benefits or eligibility. Lawmakers argue the policy shift would make it easier for families to access affordable, convenient meals, with Representative Krista McDonald-Rivet calling it, quote, ridiculous for the government to tell working parents they can't buy such a common staple, and adding that the change is common sense, making life a little easier for families struggling to make ends meet without costing taxpayers a single dime. Supporters also emphasized the practical benefits, with Senator Jim Justice stating, quote, we have to give people the option to put a healthy, protein-dense choice on the table that actually tastes good and doesn't take an hour and a half to cook. I'll second that notion. And while we're at it, what about raising a family in general in these United States? Location, location, location. A new report from Wallet Hub ranking the best states to raise a family makes something very clear. In the U.S., family life isn't just a personal decision, it's an economic calculation. The study evaluated all 50 states across dozens of metrics, from housing affordability and childcare costs to healthcare, education, safety, and job opportunities. At the top of the list are states like Massachusetts, Minnesota, and North Dakota, places that tend to have stronger public systems, better access to care, and more stable economic conditions. At the bottom are states like New Mexico, Virginia, Mississippi, where lower wages, higher poverty, and weaker infrastructure make raising a family significantly harder. The pattern isn't complicated. Where material conditions are stronger, families do better. What's especially revealing is how uneven affordability is even among higher-ranked states. New York, for example, scores well overall thanks to strong schools and healthcare systems, but ranks poorly when it comes to housing affordability and childcare costs. That contraction highlights a core issue. Access to quality services doesn't mean much if working families can't afford to live there. In many places, childcare alone can rival a second income, forcing families into impossible trade-offs between work and caregiving. Ultimately, what this report is really measuring is how well each state supports working people, whether wages align with the cost of living, whether public investments reduce the burden on families, and whether there's any real stability to build a life on. The takeaway is hard to ignore. Family outcomes aren't driven by abstract values or cultural narratives, but by concrete economic conditions. In today's U.S., the ability to raise a family successfully depends less on personal choice and more on geography, where your zip code determines whether that life is realistically within reach. And here's another nasty indicator of our rapacious system: car insurance.
A woman whose car was smashed into by an alleged armed robber fleeing Buffalo police last Wednesday is speaking out tonight with a cautionary tale on auto insurance. Catherine Scaglione is in a jam.
So I've paid every year close to $1,700 a year for insurance, and I have no car for it.
Her car was parked along Prospect Avenue Wednesday night, where moments before officers walked up on an armed robbery in progress at the 7-Eleven at Prospect and Connecticut Street and ended up shooting the suspect, now identified as 42-year-old Jawan Williams, after Williams allegedly pointed a gun at them. Williams is then accused of stealing a car and driving it for 3 blocks before it crashed right into her 2018 Chevy Impala. It was totaled. She got on the phone with her insurance carrier only to be told she's not covered for this.
I have a basic plan, so when it came down to it, I found out through the insurance company that I have no coverage at all with my car, and I'm not in it. So I only have coverage if I'm liable.
She bought the car from a relative, did not finance it through a bank, and opted not to carry collision or comprehensive coverage on the vehicle.
I don't know if I would have been able to afford it, even if I wanted it. And also the statistics of having your car totaled by some stranger is minimal, but not impossible. So I took the risk, and that was my downfall.
She can't go after the owner of the car that hit hers because it was stolen. She imagines she can't go after Williams either.
At this point, I feel like it's a lost cause, because if the gentleman's taking over a 7-Eleven, he probably doesn't have enough food for himself, let alone good insurance, even a car. You stole a vehicle.
But she remains in good spirits despite the hand that fate dealt her.
If I don't laugh, I might cry, but it's just, I learned now that I won't be parking on the street. I'll find a way to park in the back more, and I won't be putting myself at risk. And probably when I get different insurance, I'll read the fine print and make sure I have proper coverage.
All right, shifting to technology and AI. Ars Technica reports that Meta plans to track employees' computer activity, including mouse movements, clicks, and keystrokes, to generate training data for its AI systems, highlighting how difficult it is to obtain high-quality data for teaching machines to perform everyday digital tasks. The tracking will occur through an internal system on work-related apps. It may include periodic screenshots to provide context for how tasks are completed. According to an internal memo, quote, "This is where all Meta employees can help our models get better simply by doing their daily work, as the company seeks real-world examples of human-computer interaction." A Meta spokesperson emphasized that the goal is to improve AI agents' ability to handle routine actions, like mouse movements, clicking buttons, and navigating drop-down menus, and said the data will not be used for employee evaluation. We'll see about that. Hopefully not, but again, with Zuckerberg, you never know. The move reflects Meta's broader push to build AI systems capable of performing office tasks autonomously, while raising concerns about workplace surveillance and the expanding role of workers in training the technologies that could eventually replace parts of their jobs. And speak of the devil, it came out Thursday that the company is planning to cut about 10% of its workforce, roughly 8,000 employees, as it ramps up its investment in AI. The layoffs, expected to begin next month, are part of a broader effort to streamline operations and redirect resources, with the company also eliminating around 6,000 open roles. In an internal memo, leadership framed the move as necessary to improve efficiency, even as it reflects a wider tech industry shift toward automation and AI-driven productivity. As one report notes, the decision is tied to ramping up AI investments and reallocating resources away from headcount, signaling a continued pivot away from labor-intensive growth. And last week, the leaders of some of the largest trade unions in the U.S. came together for a conference with Bernie, according to Axios. Together, they presented a unified opposition against tech companies pushing AI and robotics into labor, renewing Sanders' call for a pause on AI development until there are more ample safety nets in place to catch workers whom labor leaders fear will be displaced.
The experts are telling us that AI and robotics is going to have a huge impact on every worker in America.
As Senator Sanders says, this is the most fundamental change that has happened in society, certainly in my lifetime, and maybe in all of history. You would think that the greatest country of the world would stop and say, what do we do about this? Not just let 5 or 10 gazillionaires have carte blanche to do whatever they want. We would say, what should we do in society?
It's really simple. Will you stand with workers in this AI future, or will you let big tech and the billionaires upend our jobs, our livelihoods, our rights, and our dignity?
So here's what I know. AI will not and AI cannot replace the dedication of those who have answered the call to become educators, nor will it replace our professional expertise.
I want to be clear about this. AI will either work for the working class or it will not work at all. That is the ultimatum. You know, the AI transition is about 2 simple questions. How much value does our labor create? And the second question is who benefits?
We have the humanity. This is the moment to do it. Senator Sanders is completely right about putting a moratorium on the building of the data centers. And that is not about stopping progress of building big buildings. That is about saying that we're not going to take one step forward until the regulation is in place. And unless that regulation is in place, then AI is not working for any of us, and we're going to stop working until AI works for us.
And yes, these big tech guys have unlimited amounts of money and have extraordinary power. But I have absolute confidence that when we stand together, we are going to beat them, and we're going to use these technologies to improve life for all people rather than making billionaires even wealthier. Thank you all so much for being here.
And to that end, there's a big decision sitting on many executive desks right now. And it's not just should they use AI. It's deeper than that. The real question is, what do they want AI to do for their business? Are they aiming to cut costs by automating work and shrinking headcount? Or are they trying to grow by using AI to amplify what people can do, unlocking new products, better service, and new revenue? That's the fork in the road. And it matters because the choice shapes everything that comes after: company culture, talent strategy, customer experience, and even the ability to keep innovating, where competitors can buy access to similar AI tools. It helps to start by separating 2 ideas that often get mashed together in boardrooms and headlines: automation and augmentation. Automation's when AI replaces a task or role. The point is, again, efficiency, doing the same work with fewer hours, fewer mistakes, and often fewer people. For organizations under heavy margin pressure, or dealing with repetitive processes that don't differentiate them, automation can feel like the obvious move. It's measurable, immediate, and looks great on a spreadsheet. Augmentation is different. It's when AI helps people perform better, faster, and more creatively. Instead of asking, how do we eliminate this work? Leaders ask, how do we make our people more capable at the work that matters? The goal isn't just lower cost. It's growth, new value creation, new ways of working, and new ways of serving customers. Now, it's tempting to frame this as a moral debate. Automation bad, augmentation good. But that misses the point. This is about strategy. The real risk is that companies chase automation for quick wins and inadvertently weaken the very capabilities they'll need long term. Why? Because focusing only on replacing labor can reduce organizational knowledge, motivation, and resilience. It also sends a clear message to employees. The best response to new technology is fear, and fear is not a strong foundation for innovation. On the other hand, when organizations treat AI as an amplifier of human capability, they create a very different dynamic. Employees can start looking for ways to use the tools, improve processes, and solve problems that were previously too expensive or too slow to tackle. In that environment, AI adoption isn't just top-down. It becomes participatory, which changes both the speed and quality of transformation. So why might augmentation win in the long run? First, augmentation targets the top line, not just the bottom line. Any company can buy similar automation software. If all organization does is standardize and cut, it may end up with the same operating model as its competitors, just leaner. But lean isn't the same thing as differentiated. Growth tends to come from distinct expertise, deeper customer understanding, stronger relationships, and faster experimentation. Those are areas where humans still matter and where AI can make them significantly more effective. Second, augmentation protects and develops talent instead of treating it purely as a cost center. When a workforce believes the company is investing in making people stronger, not replacing them, it's far more likely to see the behaviors that drive success: curiosity, learning, responsible risk-taking. That's not soft. It's a competitive advantage, especially when every organization is competing for people who can work effectively with AI. Third, augmentation improves how technology is adopted. Many leaders eventually realize that the hardest part of implementing AI isn't the model, it's the human system around it. People need to understand what the tool is for, where it helps, where it doesn't, and how to integrate it into daily work. When AI is framed as a partner rather than a replacement, resistance decreases and real usage increases. That means value shows up not just in pilot programs, but in everyday operations. And fourth, augmentation can strengthen culture and well-being. Well-being belongs in business conversations because it directly affects performance. When AI removes the most tedious and draining parts of work while leaving people with more meaningful problem solving, energy and engagement can improve. But when AI adoption is experienced as surveillance, de-skilling, or a prelude to layoffs, the opposite tends to happen: anxiety, disengagement, and turnover. The same technology can produce very different outcomes depending on the intent behind it. None of this means automation should be avoided. Many tasks, especially those that are repetitive, rules-based, and don't require nuanced judgment, are ideal candidates for automation. The problem arises when automation becomes the default objective, pursued mainly because it makes the next quarter's numbers easier. A useful way to frame it is this: automate tasks, augment people. If a task is truly commodity work, it makes sense to automate it. But if the work is tied to customer trust, creativity, leadership, relationships, or complex decision-making, organizations will usually get more lasting value from augmentation, equipping people with better tools and better information so they can do what humans do best. For CEOs and senior leaders choosing a path, a few questions are worth asking. First, when defining AI success, is the focus mainly on cost reduction or also on new value creation? In other words, is the strategy designed to make the company smaller or better or more innovative? Second, what happens to organizational capability if the people doing this work are removed? Is the company eliminating waste or eliminating insight, judgment, and institutional knowledge it may later need? Third, how will employees experience the change? Will they see AI as a tool that helps them succeed or as a threat to kill their jobs? The story the workforce believes will shape adoption performance and retention. And fourth, are jobs and workflows being redesigned, or are new tools simply being dropped into existing processes? AI alone doesn't create transformation. Real transformation comes from rethinking how work is done end to end, which requires leadership, communication, and often new skills. The bottom line is this: AI will change how companies operate regardless of the path they choose. But the organizations that thrive over time are likely to be those that use AI not only to remove costs, but to expand capability, combining machine speed with human judgment, machine scale with human empathy, and machine consistency with human creativity. In other words, the long-term winners may be the companies that treat AI less like a substitute for people and more like an upgrade for what people can do. And that isn't just a technology decision. It's a strategic choice about what kind of organization they're building. All that being said, we've had many stories in the past few months about how AI isn't reducing work, but intensifying it. Teams are being pushed to do more with less. Workload is increased, along with the risk of burnout. So let's talk about that for a minute, because most of us are time poor. There's always this and that to do, not just at work as we know, but there's the kids and the money and the cost of living, juggling schedules, and on and on and on. As a consequence of our hustle culture, there's an idea that most of us have absorbed at some point. If you can't get yourself moving, if you're procrastinating, if you keep falling behind, it must mean there's something wrong with your character. Lazy, unmotivated, checked out. And we say those words so quickly that we skip the obvious question sitting underneath them. What if that person already tried? What if they've been trying for a long time? What if what you're calling laziness is actually a system that's been pushed past its limit and finally started shutting down? More and more psychology research points to something that challenges our love affair with hustle culture. A lot of people who get labeled as lazy aren't avoiding efforts. They're dealing with the after effects of chronic stress and prolonged overwork. From the outside, burnout and laziness can look almost identical, but on the inside, they're completely different experiences. Let's talk about what burnout actually looks like, why it's so often misunderstood, and what it takes to recover when your brain and body have been running on fumes. When people imagine burnout, they tend to picture a dramatic moment. Someone snaps, someone cries at their desk, someone quits in a blaze of glory, a public breakdown. But real burnout's usually quieter than that. It looks like someone slowly shrinking. They stop raising their hand. They hesitate before replying to messages. They're not eager anymore, and they're not fast anymore. They're still there technically, but they're not really present the way they used to be. And that's where the judgment starts, because from a distance it can look like they stopped caring. But from the inside, it feels more like you're trying to drive a car with an empty tank, pressing the pedal harder and harder and wondering why nothing is happening. Here's the key shift in perspective. Your nervous system has a threshold. It can carry only so much for only so long before it starts protecting you by shutting things down. In fact, the World Health Organization officially classified burnout in 2019 as an occupational phenomenon. Their definition centers on chronic workplace stress that hasn't been successfully managed, and it boils down to three big pieces: exhaustion, a growing mental distance from your work, and reduced effectiveness. That definition is useful for one reason in particular. It doesn't frame burnout as a moral failure. There's no bad attitude there, no lack of willpower, no implication that you're choosing to be this way. Burnout isn't a decision. It's closer to a circuit breaker tripping. When too much load hits the system for too long, the system doesn't keep going forever out of virtue. It shuts down because that's the protective mechanism. And here's something that's easy to miss. The people who are most likely to get hit hard are often the ones who hold out the longest, the ones who were dependable, the ones who kept saying, "I'm fine," until they couldn't even hear themselves anymore. So why is burnout so common? One reason is that we reward the exact behaviors that lead to collapse. A lot of workplaces, and honestly a lot of social circles, treat unsustainable effort like a personality trait to admire. It's especially harsh because long-term overwork doesn't just make you tired. It changes how you think and act. When people repeatedly work beyond their capacity with no real recovery, cognitive performance drops. Emotional regulation gets worse. Decision-making gets harder. The very traits that make someone a high performer are often the first things to erode when they never stop performing. So the outside world sees someone slowing down and assumes they've lost discipline. But what may be actually happening is that the brain and body are no longer able to deliver what they used to under that constant strain. Then comes the part that really traps people: shame. Have you ever felt guilty for being tired? Not just tired, but tired and angry at yourself for being tired. That's the shame spiral. It's when you're depleted, and instead of responding with compassion or curiosity, you respond with self-attack. People in burnout often join in with the criticism they're receiving. They look at their own stalled energy and think, "What's wrong with me? I used to be able to do this. Everyone else seems to manage. Why can't I?" And when people around them label it as laziness, it doesn't motivate them. It confirms their worst fear, that they're failing, that they're weak, that they're not valuable unless they're producing. A huge part of healing from burnout is unlearning the idea that busyness equals worth. That sounds simple, but it's not. Many of us were trained into that belief early. Some of us grew up watching adults treat exhaustion like proof of dedication. No one called it burnout. They called it responsibility. They called it ambition. They called it being tough. If you learn that framework, it makes perfect sense that rest would feel like guilt instead of relief. Now let's talk about recovery, because this is where the just push through it advice falls apart. Real burnout recovery doesn't usually happen in a weekend. It often doesn't even happen with a single vacation, because the problem isn't that you need a brief pause from work. The problem is that your whole system has been calibrated around stress, urgency, adrenaline, and constant output. For many people, recovery takes months of deliberate, sometimes frustratingly ordinary recalibration. It can look like doing less and not being able to explain it. It can look like moving slower, needing more sleep, struggling with focus, and rebuilding your capacity bit by bit instead of snapping back. That's the difference that matters here. Laziness is about avoiding effort when you're capable of it. Burnout is what happens after too much effort for too long, without sufficient recovery, acknowledgement, or support. So if someone in your life looks like they've given up, consider the possibility that they gave too much first. Consider that what you're calling laziness might actually be depletion. And if you're the one in that fog right now, staring at your list, staring at your inbox, staring at your day and wondering why you can't make yourself move the way you used to, hear this clearly. Struggling to function is not proof that you're weak. It may be proof that you've been strong for too long without enough support. Here's a takeaway I want to leave you with. The next time you feel the urge to judge someone for not keeping up, pause and ask yourself what you actually know about what they've been carrying. And if you're judging yourself, try swapping the accusation for a question. Am I lazy or am I burned out? Because that one distinction can be the difference between pushing yourself deeper into shutdown and starting the slow process of recovery. The more we understand burnout for what it is, the less we'll punish people for showing the symptoms of being human. And we have to acknowledge Workers' Memorial Day coming up tomorrow for all the workers who have been killed, injured, or left sick on the job. And also, of course, coming up next Friday, we have the big fight back, the big one for May Day, May 1st. According to Common Dreams, a broad coalition of organizations is banding together to stage thousands of planned May Day events across the U.S., based around the theme of building an economy for workers over billionaires. May Day Strong, an initiative anchored by 500 labor and community organizations, is set to host more than 3,000 events around the country to demand higher taxes on the wealthiest Americans, an end to U.S. ICE and the war with Iran, and an expansion of democracy over corporate rule. Organizers of the events are asking participants to refrain from engaging in any economic activity on May 1st, which means no work, no school, no shopping. This particular action was inspired by the one-day general strike that residents of Minneapolis waged in January to protest against the occupation of their city by ICE. Flagship demonstrations will be held in major U.S. cities from coast to coast, with thousands of smaller events scheduled to take place in all 50 states. Greg Namaker, president of Minnesota-based SEIU Local 26, drew on the Minneapolis experience to explain what the May Day protests are trying to achieve. Quote, "In January in Minnesota this year, we experienced the power when community and workers act together to defend our rights and shared values. This May Day is a chance for us locally and nationally to build on those lessons. We're ready to fight to protect our families and our cities from the billionaire agenda of division and hate." And that's where we'll leave it this week. Hit that subscribe button, like and share so I can get this message out to more of our brothers and sisters. Thanks for watching. And to my audio people, thanks for listening. Solidarity, always.